Right, well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and hopefully today what I can do is get across some of the real enthusiasm that I have for digitisation projects and how they can have, I think if they're done well, they can have a really tremendous impact. And what I've been asked to do really is to try and put the day in context a little bit, and what I'm going to do is probably tell a couple of stories really about digitisation projects that I've been involved with, and try and unpick a few of the techniques for successful planning of those projects. So I first came into digitisation back in the higher education digitisation service. We obviously had a pretty snappy website, as you can see on screen there. It was a really tremendous experience. It was in the early 2000s, and I got the opportunity to work with scores of projects and some really good people as well. Worked very closely with Simon Tanner and Ian Breary, who I know are in the audience today. And what I'm going to do today is focus on a couple of those projects. The first one is the Old Bailey Online, which is probably the benchmark for what a successful historical digitisation project looks like. And I'm also going to talk about a project that I did after Heads, which is called A Database, which was successful in lots of different ways, but it also had quite a few challenges. And it's easy for me to talk about mistakes when it was me that actually made them. But I'll get into those stories a little bit later. The first thing to talk about really is about the basic principles and why we digitise. And there are normally three main reasons for that, so there's lots of others as well. Access, because if you have an object or something within your collection that's only in your collection, then for people to access it, they have to travel there. They have to come and physically see them and request it. If your object is digital, of course, then the access is effectively unlimited, particularly if you make it freely accessible online. And digitisation also has the potential to unlock the information that exists within an object as well, and I think that's quite an important point. You can delve much deeper than just the images of pages, if it's a book, or even just the frames of a film, if you can go within it. Preservation is all about whether, if you've got objects and you've got materials which are at risk, which are fragile, and accessing them digitally, particularly in high resolution, is a lot safer than handing them out to everybody that walks through your doors. Sometimes, of course, it has the opposite effect, and it increases the demand to see the object, and there's a few notable examples of that. But fundamentally, digital access can protect the original, and it also provides a snapshot of a record's condition. Also, preservation these days it relates to digital preservation, which is a whole other area. That's about, if you've gone to the effort of digitising your material, then it's about making sure that the digital objects are kept safe as well. So the underlying principles there really are to make the process as safe as possible, and something I'm going to say a few times today, which is do it once and do it right if you possibly can. Research is a broad area, and often facilitating research is one of the core functions of a digitisation project. So demand for materials for research can be one of the motivators. And it's important to make sure then, again, that you make sure that the right information is captured and it's broad and as open as possible, because it's an awful lot of effort to put into doing something if at the end of it you haven't got you're not fulfilling the need that you started off with. And a good example of this is I'm working on a project at the moment with the British Postal Museum and Archive. They're going through exciting times at the moment because in 2016-2017 they're going to be opening a new museum building just near Mount Pleasant, with all sorts of great things in it, like a ride on the underground mail rail system, which ran for 75 years until 2003. And one of the things is they're doing, what I'm helping them with is to set up and design their digitisation studio and their processes. And research is one of their main drivers. So when you think about digitising, they've got a huge and very diverse collection. But if you think about digitising stamp material, philately material, first of all, then what I initially thought of straight away is making sure that you capture the best possible images of the stamps. And you go into a tremendous amount of detail so you can get the right colour balance, the correct, and capture all the information on the stamp. But I had a meeting just the other day with Martin Devereux and one of their philatelist researchers. And what that particular person was more interested in is actually the print marks on the registration sheets, because his particular sphere of interest was all about digitising and all about finding out about the print process and actually how the prints were made, how the stamps were made. And so, in that case, he would be much more interested in capturing a broader range of information than is actually just immediately there on the stamp. But whilst I'm talking about the BPMA, I can't resist also showing you a little video clip. And that's because, you know, for me, this is where the magic of digitisation starts to happen. You remember I was telling you about the mail rail system and the ride. Well, what they've done just recently with a company called ScanLabs is they've actually done a 3D scan of the inside of the mail rail network. And that 3D scan is absolutely breathtaking. It's done with lasers and fisheye lenses, and it's all pulled together into a walkthrough. So I'd just like to show you a very brief clip of it because it really took my breath away. You can actually put on 3D virtual reality goggles and walk through the entire system if you want to, but it's absolutely amazing the level of detail. It only took them a week. So for me, really, digitisation is as much about innovation as it is about anything else. And that's what you need. You know, it's very exciting when you can start to do completely new and different things. So big thanks to the Postal Museum and ScanLabs for allowing me to show that to you today. Okay, so for me, really, with planning successful digitisation projects, there are three key principles, and those are perspective, open data, and collaboration. I'll talk about perspective first. What do I mean? Well, what I mean by perspective is that when you're planning and looking at digitisation projects, it's vitally important to focus on the detail, but then also focus on the big picture, and keep pulling focus between those two things at all times. Because by looking at the big picture in particular, you keep asking the question about why you're doing the project. And the detail, I mean, I've fallen foul a lot of getting into the detail too much because I'm a fully paid up member of the Geek Club, unfortunately, and I've resisted I'm also a Yorkshireman, so I've resisted the temptation of buying an Apple Watch, but I really want one. But yes, so by focusing, it's very easy to get too into the detail in the process, and you need to keep focused on the big picture to make sure that the outcomes of the project are correct. And actually, a database, the project that I did after Heads, was a pretty good example of that. What we did in a database, what we were trying to do, told you that was going to happen, excuse me, was trying to make an open source contemporary art database that effectively democratized the access to contemporary art online. So the idea was that everybody's work would be seen in an even way and that users would be able to navigate fluidly through the material. The project was set up by A Foundation as the organisation funded by James Moores that carried out and that conceived of the Liverpool Biennial of Contemporary Art. And we started off by doing an awful lot of research, and we had some really generous help from organisations like the Mellon Foundation, through Art Store, Harvard University, Visual Resources Association, and many others. And at the end of the day, what we decided to do is we decided to break the mould a little bit and take a brand new metadata schema, which wasn't stupid at all, no. Take a brand new metadata, actually it wasn't, because the metadata schema is fantastic, from the VRA called VRA Core 4. And what we did is we basically built the first relational database online using that metadata schema. And what that allowed us to do, and the reason why we chose it, is it allowed us to show the difference between, for example, an artwork and the surrogates of that artwork, which is quite an important distinction. If you take, this is just an example of an artwork record that we had on a database from the Liverpool Biennial. But fundamentally, if you've got a piece of performance art, for example, the artwork is the performance, but a video of it is a surrogate. And so what you have to do is be able to link those through in a granular way through the metadata schema if at all possible. And what we did is we created records for effectively what we called who, what, when, and where. So who is the artists, what is the artworks themselves, when is the exhibitions and where are the locations of the exhibitions. And so it allowed users to navigate fluidly through the content and effectively find stuff that they weren't necessarily looking for, which with contemporary art seems to be a pretty good theme. So we started with collections primarily, and we populated the database. These are some of the collections we did online here. Fact, the Arnold Feeney, Liverpool Biennial, and so on. We also worked with the John Deacon Archive, and we had the opportunity of photographing all of the objects in the Design Museum collection. So it was very successful. We did about 30,000, catalogued about 30,000 records onto the system. But there was a bit of a problem, and that is that the original concept, and actually it's an idea that I had in its embryonic form when I graduated as an art student, when I was 21, and was a little bit disappointed to discover that you can't get a job doing that. So the idea of getting artists into cataloguing their artwork was basically the driver behind it. Get artists cataloguing their work, break down the barriers. It was, it was a proper revolutionary moment, or at least I thought so. But I overlooked something because I was so focused on the detail. I overlooked the fact that artists in general aren't particularly interested in cataloguing their artworks. They're much more interested in making them and selling them. And so actually, we built the entire project on a premise that was fundamentally wrong. And I don't know why that went wrong. I think it's possibly my over-enthusiasm. Maybe I wasn't listening. More than likely, I wasn't asking the right questions. But it's a very good example of how perspective was probably the most important technique I should have used in that particular project. So the second concept is open data. Now, open data doesn't necessarily mean open source. What it means is accessible. So it's about removing the barriers to access for data, if at all possible, keeping the mechanisms for storing and access as open as possible. Open data means open access, open content, open collections. And it also means looking at non-proprietary file formats. It's something that I know a lot of us bang on about. But things like lossless JPEG 2000 for images, which are being used by the Wellcome and the British Library and the National Archive, to name just three. But XML for your metadata, and PDFA, which is the preservation format for PDF documents. Metadata is a very important thing. Metadata is as much about keeping your data well organized as it is about anything else. And organized data also allows other systems to interrogate your information. And they can do that either directly, in some cases, or via APIs, application program interfaces. And what that means is that you might set out to do a project for a particular audience, but if your data is open, then you can open the doors to other audiences and to broaden it. Collaboration, pretty obvious in some ways. Working together is smart. The more you collaborate, the more different people you have, obviously within the bounds of practicality, the more audiences you're potentially accessing. A challenge shared is a challenge halved. At least that's the wisdom, that's the received wisdom that we have. The more heads on a job that you have, the better it is. And it also feeds back to the perspective point, which is about validating and reality checking all along the way, bouncing ideas around, getting the best solutions, and keeping sight on the big picture. If you're around a table with a group of collaborators on a project, and somebody comes up with an idea, then somebody else is always going to say, but why should we be doing that in the context of the actual project? And that's a really important point. Okay, so let's look a little bit about applying these principles. And the first thing, the most difficult question in a sense, is to define success. Some dictionary somewhere said that the success is the accomplishment of an aim or purpose, which sounds pretty straightforward. But I think the thing with digitisation projects is actually very important to find out what success looks like for you. For a lot of people, and certainly when I first got involved in digitisation, success equaled getting the project done. Getting it done on time, on budget, and digitising everything you plan to digitise. But that's really not going to cut it anymore, particularly in the context of funding, getting funding, and also what you do when you've received funding. And Simon's going to talk about that immediately after me. But in the context of funding, it's very much more about measurable impact, and what is it that you're planning to do going to be impacting on its audience? Is it going to grow audiences? Is it going to result in your materials being used in new and innovative ways? And the key thing is how you measure that success, because measurable is the key term, really. And you have to be thinking right the way through the planning process as to how you build in mechanisms for measuring how successful you've been, because particularly if you've received external funding, at some point you're going to be called to task on that. So we look at planning the project, and we look at the steps about planning within planning a project. They break down to the ones on the screen at the moment. We start first with material selection, and selecting the materials to digitise is obviously where this all begins. And it's about selecting materials in the context of the perceived value that they're going to have to the wider organisation and to the audience. Obviously, there's practical considerations as well. Access, preservation and research we talked about at the beginning. You know, can these materials be digitised safely? We need to ask questions like, you know, have we got something that's unique within our collections? Is it regularly requested? Is it at risk from being handled, for example? Really what you're looking for, the holy grail, if you will, is a discrete cohort of material which is acknowledged as valuable by your audience and the researchers, that's safe to digitise, and that the ultimate resource is going to be of real benefit to your audience and particularly the wider public. If you can find that, and you're not necessarily going to find all of those things, but if you can find that, then you've got a pretty good candidate for digitisation. And collaboration comes into it again, because if you can get the buy-in from your collaborators and academics and other institutions, it's probably a good sign. So it's easy to get carried away, and I've worked with organisations where this has happened and where plans have changed in the early stages, because you know what you've got in your collections, in your libraries, your archives, your museums. You know what you have, and you're excited about particular materials, but you have to make sure that everyone else is as excited about it as you are, because you're working with it every day. So you think I've got this hidden resource, it's magnificent, but actually you have to think about what relevance that has to your audience. So we look at the audience now. Understanding who your audience is the key to understanding the potential impact of the project. You know, are there statistics available? You know, you've got materials requests, forums, suggestion boxes even. You know, websites of societies of people that constantly come in and request your material. And market research can also be valuable. It's so easy to put together a survey nowadays in SurveyMonkey and send it out to a group of people that you know access your material and make sure that you're on the right track. And collaborators can also bring their own audience data and ideas. And once that audience is defined, you can then set your goals and also put the mechanisms in place, or at least plan for that, to measure those goals. The digitisation process itself is fundamentally a series of decisions. What to digitise? Is it the objects themselves, the information within them, or both? Probably. The resulting resource has to be fit for purpose, and it has to work for the plans that you've had and the intended outcomes, and also, if you can, the unexpected. This comes back to open data again. The broadest possible data that you can have, what that allows you to do is to at least service the current audience and potentially allow for some unexpected outcomes, positive unexpected outcomes. Capturing the content itself, well, there are as many ways to capture material as there are different types of materials themselves, and Richard Everett from The Welcome is going to talk about image capture a bit later. But building the process around your conservation process is probably the number one rule, because you have to make sure that the digitisation you do is safe and that you're going to handle the materials as little as possible. Capture everything you need at the outset. As I've said before, do it once and do it right. And then coming back to open data again, make sure that you design for non-proprietary file formats so the data you're generating is easier to manage and preserve ongoing. When it comes to capture, we have to look at the interesting. I always like to put a bit of XML up there because it normally bamboozles everybody. But that's actually part of Dublin Core. But when it comes to digitising materials, it's important to think about whether you're capturing information within an object you're digitising, or you're just interested in the object itself. You know, with some museum objects, it's the external or internal appearance of an object, but with monographs and with documents, it's can often be as much about capturing text information. And metadata is the best way to organise your information full stop within a system, but also to organise the information you use to help people find the objects that they're looking for and the information they're looking for. And it gives us the opportunity also of analysing materials in terms of their structure. So looking at the internal structure of a book, for example. And with text, we have techniques available like optical character recognition, intelligent character recognition, although the jury's still out on that one, if I'm honest, and double rekeying, which, of course, generates potentially the most accurate content, particularly from older material. And it might be possible to integrate your data with taxonomies as well. So these are pre-organised lumps of data which exist about the way in which your information should be categorised. And there's lots of those available as well. So it comes back to collaboration again. If you can engage with your community and your partners, they can help you define what parts of the data they're interested in, and then you can hardwire that into the digitisation process. And you can do pilots, that's what they're for. You know, if you do pilots and, you know, take a small amount of material as a subset and then look at the resulting data, look at the information and get the feedback from your audience and from your collaborators as to whether that's going to work. You know, assess the quantities. And I was at the National Archives last week, and the biggest part of their digitisation process, massive part of it, is actually doing a survey at the start to understand their quantities and exactly what it is, the size of the task that they're looking at. So again, make sure it'll work and then come back out to the big picture again. Making information available, for those of us that don't have big shiny rooms with blinking lights in them like this and very powerful air conditioning, and I have to say that my organisation certainly doesn't, but you have to think about how you're going to make your information available. Are you going to use an existing system that you have, such as your catalogue or museum management system? Buy one, go for an open source system and then spend probably the same money or more on programming it and configuring it. And you need to consider the long-term digital preservation of the data and where you're going to keep it. And Simon, in the early days of working at Head, Simon taught me a brilliant acronym, which was LOCKSS, L-O-C-K-S-S, which stands for lots of copies, keeps stuff safe, which I think is fantastic. So you need to think about whether you're going to host something internally or via the cloud. And the cloud is, you know, it's developed massively recently, so it's lowered the costs and increased the benefits. And if you're a smaller organisation with limited internal IT resource, it's a really strong candidate, in my opinion, for making that data available and doing it safely. And I'm going to quote from Douglas Adams here, one of my favourite authors, and that's, to a certain extent, using the cloud can make looking after your data an SEP, and that acronym he defined as somebody else's problem, which I quite like. But the thing is, the cloud shouldn't ever be the only copy. Digital preservation isn't a passive thing. You don't just put it in a box and leave it there. You have to check it, migrate it, check some of the data, make sure you're not losing bits of information. So it is an active process, and so don't underestimate the costs that that's going to involve in your project. So, at the risk of harping on about it, let's come back to open data again. When you are considering making your data available, choose a route that keeps the data open. I've got a lot. This is the list of metadata schemas that are on the JISC site. And you know, there are a huge amount, a huge variety of different metadata schemas available. And you may actually be forced to use your own or to develop your own metadata schema if your data is particularly specific. But if you can do that, then it's important, you know, metadata schemas are the, you know, the language, the translation module, in a sense, for systems to access your information. It keeps the data organised, and it has a tremendous amount of positive benefits when it comes to looking at structured data and for other systems in particular to access your information. So when you're defining your goals, to a certain extent, you have to let the planning define the goals for you. So share with your collaborators and establish ambitious but also feasible and realistic goals. Build in the mechanisms to measure the impact, which can be tracking, feedback forms, surveys, forums, discussion groups, you name it. There's lots of ways to engage with your audience. And then define the measurements that are going to prove that at the end of the day, you've done what it was you set out to do and maybe achieved something else as well. And keep the 3 principles running throughout the planning process and throughout the project. Right, well, I've kept you waiting long enough. I'll talk a little bit in more detail about the Old Bailey now. So the Old Bailey Online, London's Central Criminal Court from 1674 to 1913. Quite a lot of you probably will have come across this site before, and if you haven't, then actually I'd be pretty surprised. But it was a huge project, massive project that was funded from lots of different sources. And actually the key is that it was collaborative from the very start. We had Professor Tim Hitchcock from the University of Hertfordshire at the time, who's now at the University of Sussex, Bob Shoemaker from the University of Sheffield, who ran the Humanities Research Institute there, still does, and Clive Emsley from the Open University. And what they all were effectively ancient 18th century historians. So what they were interested in doing was cataloguing and finding out a resource about everyday people from the period. And that's the thing about the Old Bailey, is that history is normally written by the winners. It's the people that won the battles that tell the story about the battles. And the thing about Old Bailey is it was about history from below, and it was about information of people actually living in London during the period from 1674 to 1913. There were 400,000 pages, 127 million words of content from, and I'm going to get this precise, 197,745 pre-1834 trial transcripts. It's the biggest body of accurately keyed in historical text available online, and it's available online for free to everybody, which is pretty unremarkable today, but at the time when they thought about the project, they conceived of it, it was actually pretty revolutionary, because the biggest content that was available at the time was coming from publishers, and you had to pay for access or you had to subscribe. So that was quite an important point that they decided to do with the project. And the collaborators, they realised, Tim and Bob initially, they realised that actually the raw text of the transcripts wasn't going to be enough for their purposes. So they devised a unique XML markup schema which defined tags that categorised all of the different crime and punishment terms of the period, and then they applied that to the text. The tags and conventions that they generated are online at the moment, and 90 of them are unique to the Old Bailey. So at Heads, what we did is we produced the images from the microfilm copies, pretty safe on the preservation front because it wasn't from any original documents. And then we project managed the keying in of the text to over 99.9% accuracy. And that wasn't easy, as you can probably see on screen. The Humanities Research Institute had a team of 8 people tagging all of the metadata tags through the entire content and validating the text up to 1835. And then after 1835, when printing techniques became better, we didn't have as many long S's, for example, after that they started to use a semi-automated markup process that was then validated and checked by a separate team from the University of Hertfordshire. And the result was a resource that was wide open, and it met the research need, but it also was able to do an awful lot more, including statistical interrogation. Of course, that gets me excited because I'm a geek and I like statistics and all that kind of thing, but it was a really groundbreaking aspect of the project. So there you can see, this is freely available to all of you. Some of you probably used it, but you can generate statistical results. And what I've done there is I've put in the details to find out by decade how many guilty verdicts were punished by transportation. And this is the resulting graph that's generated instantaneously. Now for ease, because it's a very horizontal screen and a very vertical web page, but for ease, what I've done is I've put the results on the right there. And what we've got is, what you can see is that by the 1830s, the amount of crimes that were punished, the guilty verdicts that were punished by transportation had risen to 8,632. Now, I haven't done that by accident, because That's another key aspect of the project. What they did by digitising Old Bailey Online is they actually generated a digital bridge. So for genealogists and family historians that were researching their family history in the transportation locations, what were then the colonies of the UK, of England, Britain, they were able to do their local historical family research, but then they had to travel, get on a plane, come over to London, research the Old Bailey transcripts, and find the information about what parish their particular relative might have been in, to then pick up the trail over here. And what the Old Bailey did is it actually bridged that gap, and it meant that they could do this whole thing electronically and save the price of a flight, although obviously coming to the UK is a great pleasure for lots of other reasons. But it allowed them to bridge that gap, and it's one of the reasons why it was such a tremendous success. Now, it wasn't an accident. You know, they built in, you know, Tim and Barb and Clive were aware of this link, and they built in the functions to do it, you know, at the same time, effectively, or by fulfilling their research aims, they were aware that they were going to be able to fulfil this facility as well, and this would give people that ability too. But that openness and foresight is what led to, I think, quite a lot of the massive impact. And it has been big. There have been over 15 million site visits and page visits since its launch in 2003. And when they implemented Google Analytics in October 2010, I think pretty much when it became available, they discovered that people from over 213 countries access the data. And that's the top 10 list. There's obviously a big focus on English-speaking countries, but there's a huge amount of people accessing it from all over the world. In this graph of page impressions, you can see a spike there of over 2 million page impressions that happened in the month of May 2008, which was at the time of the second launch of the site. But what's almost even more remarkable is that it's levelled out at about 12,000 page impressions on the Old Bailey Online every day today. So it's absolutely tremendous. It's used actively for research, for teaching, and it's increasingly being used for non-academic and family history and leisure use and personal research. Obviously, lots of media coverage, including Garrow's Law, which I'm sure we all enjoyed between 2009 and 2011. But where it gets really exciting for me is about all the other projects that are using the data and generating different data sets and research outcomes and resources. And this is the list. And those of you that can recognise some of those projects up there will realise that it's actually, you know, some very major and very groundbreaking projects in and of their own right. And what they're doing is using that data that was generated by Old Bailey and mapping it to maps of the period and so on and so forth. So it's it has an extremely broad reach. And it was a big privilege, it was a huge privilege for me to be involved in the project. It had its challenges, obviously. It wasn't easy, and we had to break some new ground in a lot of areas. But through the active use of the three key principles, the collaborators and heads and all the other organisations that were involved were able to make it work, and it was an absolute joy to be involved with. So when I was preparing this talk, I obviously spoke to Tim Hitchcock at the University of Sussex and firstly asked his permission to talk about his project, and he said no, unfortunately. No, he didn't. He said yes. Thankfully, he's a generous man. And I also asked him about his experience and his experiences doing Old Bailey Online, and he was very generous again with his answers. He said that there were huge benefits to collaboration, to working together for a maximum benefit for the broadest range of people, and that was the thing I think that really that he really enjoyed about the process, the collaboration and what it brought to the table. He was very, very interested in keeping the data open and freely accessible, and free was the big thing for him, if at all possible. And there are plenty of reasons why you can't as well. And that's, you know, this is in some respects it was a perfect storm of the right ideas and the right material without copyright restrictions and so on. But you know, if you can make it freely available, then do so. And that the key to success for him is to resist the temptation. I think he was just saying this to me actually. To resist the temptation to get caught up in the technology, Geoff. Okay, the technology is out there, and it can either already do the things that you want it to do, or it can be built to do the things that you want it to do. There are a lot smarter people than me out there that have the ability to do all kinds of amazing things, like scanning the inside of mail rail. But you need to understand why you're doing the project, and then the technical decisions should flow directly from there, and relatively straightforwardly from there. It becomes obvious, he said, what the right decision is when you keep focusing on why you're doing the project. So he said you should keep, his advice was to keep stepping back and ask yourself and your partner organisations these questions. What is the project's purpose? Why are you doing it? What impact will the project have, and to whom? And the to whom part is quite important. And if you're steered by these questions, in Tim's opinion and in mine, then you're not going to go far wrong. And I don't think I can say much more than that. So I hope this talk's been useful for you today. It's a large area to cover in I know it seems like a lifetime to you, but for me it feels like a really short period of time. So I hope it's been useful for you. There isn't really a straightforward trick to planning a successful digitisation project, but the lessons from the past that I've had have taught me that if you follow those three principles of keeping everything in perspective, thinking about open data and collaborating as much as you can, then you have the best chance of selecting the right materials, understanding your audience, doing the digitisation right, and reaching that audience with your data. And you're probably even going to have quite a few positive surprises along the way. So don't forget that there is also a community available. You're it, but there's a community available to share with, and I think that's a lot of the point about what today's about, is sharing experiences as well, to get on with your project. So if you've started, you're about to start, or you're thinking of starting a project, or frankly, if you've just finished, whatever, I wish you all the very best of luck, and I'm excited for you. I really am. Thank you very much for listening.